There are names a man never stops hearing, even when the world goes quiet around him. Not his own name. Other men's names fade and blur with age, and that is probably a mercy. But the names of people he failed, people he drove away, people he loved badly and too late, those names don't fade. They sharpen. They find him in the mornings before he's fully awake, when his guard is down and his coffee hasn't had time to build a wall between him and the truth of what his life has been. Maybe you know exactly what that feels like. That particular weight of a name you carry without being asked to. A name that belongs to someone you wronged or lost or left behind without meaning to leave behind for good. If you know that feeling, then you already understand more about Harlan Voss than most people who had known the man for years. Harlan had been hearing his son's name that way for 11 years. Lying there on a narrow cot before dawn in a house that was too quiet and too large for one man, thinking Monroe, 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 the way you press a bruise. Not because it feels good, but because some part of you needs to know it still hurts. He deserved that hurt. He knew it. He had known it the evening Monroe rode off the property with a single bag strapped to his saddle, and never once looked back, because looking back would have required Harlan to have given him a reason to look back. And Harlan, in his stubbornness and his pride and his particular talent for being wrong in a way that cost him everything, had not managed to provide one. He had stood in the doorway and watched his son leave and told himself that Monroe would come around. That was the word he used even then in the private language of his own thoughts. Come around. As if his son's grief were a piece of weather that would eventually pass. As if 11 years of silence were just a long season. The Voss Ranch sat in a wide basin between two low ridges in country that was beautiful in the mornings and brutal by afternoon, where the grass grew thick in spring and dried to a pale yellow by July, where the nearest settlement was a full day's ride south and almost nobody came up the North Trail without a reason. Harlan liked it that way. He had built this place when he was 32 years old with his wife Clara and a pair of young bulls and 47 head of mixed cattle, and for 20 years it had been exactly what he wanted it to be. Full, loud, alive. Clara's voice in every room, Monroe's boots on the porch steps at all hours. The sound of a ranch with people in it who were glad to be there. Clara had died of fever when Monroe was 15. And something in Harlan had calcified in the grief of that, hardened into a man who was shorter and colder and less capable of saying the things that needed to be said, and Monroe, at 15, had needed things said. Had needed them desperately. And Harlan had given him silence and hard work, and a father who looked through him most days like he was a window, and by the time Monroe was 23 and had his own opinions about the ranch and how to run it and how to live, opinions that differed from Harlan's in ways that should have been opportunities for conversation and became instead a long and ugly argument that lasted the better part of a year. There was not enough left between them to survive it. Monroe had left. Harlan had stayed, and the ranch, which had once been full, went quiet. He ran the cattle with 2 seasonal hands now, a man named Duff, who was 63 and moved like someone held together by rope and habit, and a younger man called Paris, who showed up every spring and left every fall and never once asked anything about the family photograph on the mantelpiece. Harlan cooked for himself, repaired what broke, kept the fence lines honest, and lived the kind of life that people call simple, because they haven't stopped to notice how hard simple can be when there's no one in the room who knows your name. It was a Thursday in late September when the boy appeared at the gate. Harlan had been working on the south fence line since early morning, replacing 3 posts that had rotted through over the summer, and he was walking back toward the barn with his tools when he saw the small shape at the gate, standing on the outside of it, not knocking, not calling out, just standing there in the long shadow of the late afternoon with his hands at his sides like he had used up everything he had just getting there and had nothing left for announcing himself. Harlan stopped walking. He stood for a moment and looked. The figure was a child, a boy, he could see that now, maybe 8 years old, maybe 9, in a canvas shirt that was 2 sizes too large and trousers held up with a piece of rope instead of a belt. His boots were wrong for the terrain, too flat, too worn, the kind of boots a child wears around a yard and not across open country. And he had walked across open country. That was clear from the state of him. The dust on his clothes was not surface dust. It had worked its way into the fabric, into the creases, the way dust does when a person has been moving through it for a long time. Harlan dropped his tools against the fence and walked to the gate. The boy watched him come and did not back up. That was the first thing Harlan noticed. That the boy held his ground. His eyes were large and dark-circled with exhaustion, but they tracked Harlan steadily, the way a tired animal watches for sudden movement before deciding whether it needs to run. He crouched down when he reached the gate, putting his eyes level with the boy's. "You all right, son?" The word came out without him thinking about it, the way it always had when he spoke to children, a habit so old it operated below the level of intention. The boy nodded, which was almost certainly a lie. His lower lip had a crack in it from the sun. His hands at his sides were shaking faintly in the particular way that hands shake when a person is trying very hard to keep them still. "Where'd you come from?" Harlan asked. The boy pointed north. North was nothing for a long way, ridge after ridge of open country with no settlements and no homesteads that Harlan knew of. "How long have you been walking?" The boy thought about it. 2 days, he said. His voice was barely there, dry as tinder. "Maybe 3. Harlan opened the gate. He brought the boy inside and sat him at the kitchen table and poured him water, first a small amount, enough to wet the throat without shocking a dehydrated stomach, and watched him drink it, and poured more. He set out cold cornbread from the morning and a piece of salt pork, and the boy ate with the focused silence of someone who is past the point of caring how he looks while he does it. Harlan sat across from him and waited. There was a particular patience that came with age, and with living alone, and with years of reading cattle and land and weather. The understanding that things reveal themselves in their own time, and pushing rarely helps, and almost always hurts. So he waited. He refilled the water. He watched the boy's hands stop shaking as the food and water did their work. After a while, the boy looked up and said, "Are you Harlan Voss?" Harlan nodded slowly. "I am." The boy exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs. "My daddy said to find you," he said. "He said if anything happened, I should go north until I found the Voss ranch and ask for Harlan." Something moved in Harlan's chest, something old and dense and not quite nameable. He kept his face still. "What's your daddy's name, son?" And the boy said, "Monroe. Monroe Voss." The kitchen went away for a moment. Not the sound of it, not the light, just the sense of it, the ordinary weight of the room, which seemed to lift and then come back down differently. Harlan was aware of his own breathing, aware of his hands on the table in front of him, the knuckles, the scars, the particular way an old man's hands look when 11 years have passed, and there is a boy sitting across from you who has your son's eyes and your son's jaw, and is looking at you with the cautious, assessing expression of a child who has been told that the person across this table might be able to help, but has learned, probably too early, that most things people tell you don't turn out exactly right. Harlan said, "You're Monroe's boy." "Yes, sir." "What's your name?" "Callum." A pause. "Callum Monroe Voss." Harlan sat with that for a moment. Then he said quietly, "How old are you, Callum?" 8. 8 years old, which meant Monroe had had a son within a year of leaving. Which meant there had been a family, a wife, a child, a life built somewhere north of here. And Harlan had known nothing about any of it, had not been told, had not been invited to know, which was not a surprise and was also a blow of the specific kind that doesn't hurt where you expect it to. He thought about the 11 years of silence, and now understood that the silence had not been empty after all, that things had been happening in it. That time had moved inside that silence the same way it moved everywhere else, forward, without asking his permission. "What happened to your daddy?" he asked. Callum's jaw tightened in a way that was startlingly familiar, a gesture Harlan recognized from Monroe at that age, from himself. "Some men came to the ranch," the boy said. 3 days ago, maybe 4. They came in the night." He stopped, looked at his hands. "Mama sent me out the back window. She said run north and find Harlan Voss and don't stop." Harlan leaned forward very slowly. "Where's your mama now, Callum?" "I don't know." The boy's voice did not break. It went flat instead, the way voices go flat when someone has already spent everything on the fear, and what's left is just the fact. "I don't know where either of them are. If you're with this story and you want to hear how it ends, go ahead and hit subscribe. There's more coming, and this one is a long way from finished." Harlan stood up from the table. He did not pace. He did not make noise. He went to the window and looked out at the yard, at the long shadows moving across the dust, at his horse in the corral. He thought about Monroe. Thought about the argument that had ended things between them. That long, ugly argument about the ranch and the cattle and the way things should be run, which had really been an argument about grief and about silence and about all the things Harlan had not said in the years after Clara died. He thought about Monroe riding off that evening with his single bag and his back straight and his face forward. And he thought about the boy at his table who had walked for 3 days across open country because his mother had told him to. He turned back to Callum. "Did you see the men who came? Could you tell anything about them from where you were?" Callum nodded. 3 of them. One was big, wore a brown coat. The others I didn't see clear. But one of them was riding a horse with a white blaze and a brand on it. A double-bar brand. Harlan knew the double-bar brand. It belonged to a man named Cutter Reese, who ran cattle on the eastern range, a man with a habit of acquiring land by making the people on it too frightened to stay. There had been talk about him in town, quiet talk, the kind people keep quiet because loud talk about Cutter Reese had a way of ending conversations permanently. Harlan had never had direct trouble with him. His land was far enough west and remote enough that it had not been worth Reese's attention. But Monroe's place, wherever Monroe had settled north of here, that was different country. That was exactly the kind of country a man like Reese would want. He crossed to the mantelpiece and took down the photograph. It was old, faded at the edges, the kind of photograph that costs more than most frontier families can easily afford and gets taken precisely because of that. Clara and Monroe and Harlan outside the east wall of the ranch house. Clara, with her hand on Monroe's shoulder, and Monroe squinting into the sun with the particular expression of a teenage boy who is doing his best not to look like he minds being photographed. Harlan had looked at it every day for 11 years. He set it on the table in front of Callum. The boy studied it for a moment. Then he pointed at Monroe. "That's my daddy." His finger moved to Clara. "Who's she?" "That's your grandmother," Harlan said. "She died a long time ago." Callum looked at the photograph for a moment longer. Then he looked at Harlan. "Are you angry at my daddy?" Harlan took the question in the spirit it was asked, which was direct and serious, and deserved a direct and serious answer. He sat back down across from the boy. "I was," he said. "For a while I told myself I wasn't, but I was." He paused. "And then I wasn't angry anymore, and I didn't know how to say so. That's not a good excuse, it's just what happened." Callum looked at him steadily. "He said you were stubborn." "He wasn't wrong. He said you were also the best rancher he ever knew." The boy said this carefully, as if he had been carrying it for a while and wasn't sure whether to put it down here. "He said that too." Harlan was quiet for a moment. The late light was coming through the window at a low angle now, filling the kitchen with the particular gold that happens just before sunset in that country. And in that light, the boy across the table looked more like Monroe with every passing second. The set of the jaw, the steadiness in the eyes, the way he held himself even when he was exhausted. It was like looking at a version of a person he had loved and lost access to, and the feeling of that was complicated in ways he didn't have words for. He stood. "Callum, I need you to do something for me. I need you to eat a little more and then sleep. You can have the room at the end of the hall. There's a bed in it, and in the morning I'm going to ride north and find your parents." He looked at the boy. "Can you do that?" Callum looked back at him. He had the expression of a child who wants very much to argue, but knows he doesn't have the physical resources for it. "What if they need help tonight?" "If they needed help tonight, there'd be nothing I could do about it in the dark," Harlan said. It was a hard truth, and he said it plainly, because the boy was plainly the kind of child who could handle hard truth better than soft fiction. "Light helps. I'll leave before dawn." He paused. "You have my word." Whatever Harlan had expected from his grandson on that first night, it was not what he got. He expected sleep to come for the boy quickly, given the state of him. But when he checked on the room an hour after Callum had gone to bed, the boy was awake, sitting up in the dark with his hands in his lap, looking at nothing with the focused quiet of someone working through a problem they can't solve. Harlan didn't say anything. He just set a lamp on the table by the door, turned low and left it burning the way he had sometimes done when Monroe was small and the thunder came. He didn't know if it would help. He did it anyway. He spent the rest of the night preparing. He oiled the Winchester and checked the revolver at his hip, loaded both and wrapped spare ammunition in a cloth and packed it with the rest of his provisions: hard bread, jerked beef, a full canteen, a second one for the road. He checked the saddle on his grey horse, a big, steady animal named Oak that Harlan had ridden for 9 years through all kinds of country and trusted the way you trust something that has never given you a reason not to. He moved through all of it in the dark, with the methodical attention of a man who has spent 50 years doing practical things and knows that in difficult moments, practical things are what hold you together. He thought about Monroe while he worked. He thought about the version of Monroe he had last seen, 23, furious, jaw set in that same way Callum's had gone tight at the table, and tried to place that image alongside the Monroe who had raised an 8-year-old boy to walk 3 days across open country and ask for Harlan Voss by name. The Monroe who had apparently told his son that Harlan was stubborn, and also the best rancher he ever knew. He turned that over in his mind for a long time, the way you turn something worn smooth by years of handling, feeling the shape of it, wondering what it means. Before first light he was in the saddle. He left Duff a note weighted down with the coffee pot, explaining enough of the situation that the old man would know to keep an eye on the boy and not to expect Harlan back for several days. He rode north out of the yard before the sky had shifted from black to gray, Oak moving at an easy pace down the trail that led up through the first ridge and into the open country beyond. The stars were still out. The air was cold in the way that frontier air is cold at that hour, not the cold of winter but the cold of a world that hasn't warmed up yet, that is still in the process of deciding what kind of day it's going to be. Harlan rode in it without speaking. The creak of the saddle and the sound of Oak's hooves on the trail were company enough. He had not been north of his own ridge in more than a year. The country up there was familiar in the way that any wide-open country becomes familiar after decades, not in the detailed personal way that your own land is familiar, every fence post and waterhole, but in the larger way of landforms and ridges and the general logic of the terrain. He knew where the water was. He knew the trails. He had ridden this country when Monroe was young, when they used to take the cattle north to the summer grass together, and those rides had been among the good things. He had not thought about them in a long time because thinking about the good things had become too complicated, too mixed up with the bad. But now, riding north in the dark before dawn, with his grandson asleep in his back bedroom and his son somewhere in trouble ahead of him, he let himself think about them. Monroe at 12, racing his pony along the North Ridge while Harlan watched from a distance laughing. Monroe had laughed a lot before Clara died, before Harlan's silence ate some of that away. Monroe at 16, sitting on the ground by a creek and asking Harlan questions about the land, how to read the grass, how to find water in a dry season, questions that had answers Harlan knew, and in those moments, the knowing and the telling had made him feel like a father in the way he sometimes couldn't manage to feel at other times. Monroe at 20, working cattle with the efficiency and confidence of a man who had learned something and learned it well, and Harlan watching him from across the herd and feeling a pride so large it scared him, which was probably why he had never found a way to say it out loud. He rode hard through the morning, stopping once to water oak at a creek, eating in the saddle. Around midday he found the first marker, a fence line running east to west that was clearly worked and maintained, the posts still straight and the wire tight, the marks of a rancher who cared about his property. He followed the fence east, and after another half hour he came over a low ridge and saw the smoke. It was not fresh smoke, not the black, urgent smoke of something actively burning, but the pale, thin smoke of embers that had been going for days, the kind that rises from the shell of a structure that has already given up everything it had. Harlan felt something cold settle in his chest and pushed Oak forward faster. Monroe's ranch was a small operation. 3 buildings, a main house, a barn, a storage shed. The barn was intact, the shed was intact. The house was not. One wall had caved in, and the roof over the western half had gone with it, and the rubble had been through a fire that had burned itself out some time ago. The yard was disturbed, tracks everywhere, horses in number, things scattered that hadn't been put back. A chair on its side near the porch steps. A woman's shawl hanging on the fence post, which was not where shawls hung when everything was ordinary. Harlan dismounted and walked the yard slowly, reading it the way he read his own land. 3 horses, as Callum had said, maybe 4. It was hard to tell where some had overlapped. They had come in from the east and left east again. He checked the barn. Monroe's horses were gone, but the barn had not been searched the way the house had. They had taken the horses and left the rest, which told him something about what kind of trouble this was. Practical trouble. The kind that wants something specific and isn't interested in what it doesn't want. He found the family in the back of the barn. Not Monroe, but a woman and a boy younger than Callum, maybe 5 years old, tucked into the far corner of a hay stall behind a grain partition that had been pulled across to hide them. The woman was on her feet the moment she heard him at the door, a pitchfork in her hands, and her eyes the precise shade of frightened that is indistinguishable from furious. She was young, late 20s, dark-haired, with the look of someone who had been awake for 3 days straight, running entirely on nerve. "Harlan Voss," she said. Her voice was worn thin. "You're Harlan Voss." "I am." She lowered the pitchfork barely. "Callum made it. He made it. He's at my ranch. He's safe." Harlan watched some of what was holding her upright shift and recalibrate. "Where's Monroe?" Her name was Adelaide. Ada, she said. That was what Monroe called her. And she had been married to Monroe for 9 years. And she told Harlan the story quickly and without decoration, because she was past the point of needing to be careful with it. Cutter Reese had wanted the land for 2 years, had made offers that were too low, and then made threats that were direct enough that Monroe had filed a complaint with the territorial sheriff, which had done nothing practical, but had made Reese angry in a more pointed way. 3 nights ago, his men had come after midnight. Monroe had gone out to face them, not to fight, to talk, to try to hold the situation at words rather than guns. and they had taken him, ridden off east with him. She had hidden the children and come to the barn and stayed there because going out on the open road with a 5-year-old at night seemed less safe than staying where she was. She had told Callum to go to Harlan Voss. She had told him Monroe would have wanted that, which was the truest thing she had said in 3 days, because it was something she believed and also something she needed to believe. Don't go anywhere. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time, because this ride isn't over. Harlan left Adelaide and the younger boy, his name was Fletcher, quiet and wide-eyed and clinging to his mother's arm, in the barn with water and food from his pack, and he rode east. He rode with the kind of focus that comes to a man who has already done his thinking and is now simply doing what he decided to do, without second-guessing, without the noise of all the arguments he might have had with himself on another day. He was 61 years old. His back ached in the cold, and his right knee had been difficult since a bad fall 3 years ago, and he had not slept. None of that felt relevant. Monroe was ahead of him somewhere. That was the fact that organized everything else. He found them in an old line camp on the eastern range, a rough stone building that had belonged to a previous owner and that Reese's men used as a holding place for situations that needed to be kept quiet. There were 2 men on guard and a third inside, and Monroe was inside with the third, his hands tied to a chair, with the particular exhausted and resolute look of a man who has been asked the same question for 3 days, and has given the same answer every time. Harlan could see through the window. He took a long time looking before he moved. He moved carefully, and he moved alone, and he moved in the particular way of a man who was raised on this country and has been reading terrain for 50 years. Which is to say, he was difficult to see coming. He came from behind, using the line of the ridge and the dead ground at the north side of the structure. The first guard he disarmed with his voice alone, which sounds simple and is not simple, except when a man speaks with a particular quality of certainty that makes people pause before they act. And the second he took down with the butt of his Winchester before the first had finished deciding what to do with himself. He was through the door before anyone inside had fully registered that something had changed outside. What followed was brief and ugly, in the way that brief things sometimes are when there's no way to make them otherwise. Harlan Voss had told himself a story for 20 years about the kind of man he was. The quiet kind. The kind who didn't go looking for trouble. The kind who stayed on his own land and minded his own business. And all of that was true. But there was another part of the story, which was that when something crossed a line he had drawn, when something came after his family, a word he had not used in 11 years and which now felt enormous in his chest. He was also the kind of man who went east in the dark on a bad knee and without backup to bring his son home. Monroe was alive. Shaken, bruised, with a cut above his eyebrow that had been poorly cleaned and a rope burn on his wrists that would take time to heal, but alive and coherent and sitting in that chair with his hands free now and looking at Harlan with an expression that Harlan could not have named and did not try to name. They looked at each other in the firelit interior of a stone building at the end of a long and complicated road between them, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. Monroe said, "Callum went to find you. He found me." Harlan paused. 8 years old, walked 3 days across open country. He didn't say much until I gave him food and water. Then he told me your name. He stopped. I left before dawn. Monroe was quiet. Something moved in his face. The same jaw set, the same internal argument happening behind the same dark eyes. Then he said, "I shouldn't have given you reason to leave before dawn." "You didn't." Harlan crossed the space between them and helped his son to his feet. "I did." They rode back together in the late light, not talking much, the way men ride who are working through things that don't have immediate words and know there will be time for words later. The country moved past them, The ridges, the grass going gold, the sky doing what the sky does out in that country when the day decides to end beautifully, which is often. Harlan rode on the left, Monroe rode on the right. Occasionally their horses came close enough that their stirrups nearly touched, and neither of them moved away from it. When they reached Monroe's ranch, Adelaide came out of the barn at the sound of hooves and stood in the yard, and Monroe dismounted before his horse had fully stopped and crossed to her, and the reunion of that was private and complete, and Harlan did not watch it. He looked at the ruined wall of the house. He looked at the fence lines, still solid. He thought about what it would take to put the roof back. He thought about the work of it. Timber first, then the framing, then the walls. He had built a house before. He knew exactly what it took. Little Fletcher appeared at the barn door and stood there looking at Harlan with wide, cautious eyes. Harlan crouched down. "You must be Fletcher," he said. Fletcher nodded. "I'm your grandfather," Harlan said, "and I'm going to need your help fixing that wall." They sent word to the territorial sheriff about Cutter Reese. Adelaide had kept documentation, letters and records of every threat, every offer, every conversation that had crossed a line. And the sheriff, who had been looking for an occasion to move on Reese for longer than he wanted to admit, found in those records exactly what he needed. Reese's men were collected. Reese himself faced consequences that took longer to arrive, but arrived with the particular finality that sometimes comes when a system works the way it's supposed to, slow and creaking, but arriving nonetheless. Harlan stayed north for 2 months. He sent word to Duff, who was apparently managing fine and had made something close to a friend of Callum in the process, and he stayed and worked. He rebuilt the west wall of Monroe's house from the foundation up, with Monroe beside him and Fletcher handing them nails, and Callum asking questions in that serious, relentless way of his that reminded Harlan of Monroe at the same age, and sometimes of himself. They worked in the mornings while the air was still cool and rested at midday, and worked again in the late afternoon. And in the evenings, Ada cooked, and they all ate at a table that was large enough for everyone, and the sound of it, the voices, the children, the ordinary noise of a family at the end of a working day, was something Harlan had not heard in 11 years and had told himself he didn't need. He had been wrong about that too. One evening, near the end of October, when the house was whole again and the roof was tight and the first cold was coming down from the north, Monroe and Harlan sat on the repaired porch, while Ada put the boys to bed. The sky had gone a deep purple over the western ridge, and the first stars were showing. Monroe had a cup of coffee. Harlan had his hands around his own. They sat for a while in the kind of quiet that is not absence but presence, the quiet of two people who have arrived somewhere that took a long time to reach and don't feel the need to narrate the fact of having arrived. Monroe said, "I should have sent word years ago that I'd had Callum, that things were—" He stopped. "I should have sent word." "Yes," Harlan said, "and I should have written first, should have written 10 years ago and said I was wrong and I was sorry. But I didn't know how to do it." He looked at his coffee. "Still don't, exactly. But I'm telling you now." Monroe was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I told Callum to find you if something happened, not just because I thought you could help." He paused. "I told him to find you because I wanted him to know you." Harlan looked out at the darkening country. He thought about a boy walking 3 days alone across open land toward a man he had never met, carrying his father's name in his mouth like a compass bearing. He thought about what that kind of faith requires, not just in the person you're walking toward, but in the idea that going is better than staying, that the hard direction is worth taking, that what's ahead might be different from what's been. He thought Monroe had raised a good son. He said so. And Monroe, for the first time since they had been back in the same place at the same time, smiled. A real one, the unguarded kind. And it was the same smile Harlan remembered from 30 years ago, from the days before things went wrong, and the sight of it was a relief so large it was almost physical. Harlan went home in November, back to his own ranch, to the quiet valley between the ridges and the cattle and the creek and the particular shape of the mornings he had built for himself, over 20 years alone. The house was the same as it had always been. Duff was the same, the fence lines were the same. But he had put something new on the mantelpiece when he returned, not just the old photograph of Clara and Monroe and himself, but a new one that Ada had taken before he left. All 5 of them outside the newly rebuilt house, the 2 boys squinting into the autumn sun, Monroe with his arm around Ada's shoulders, Harlan standing at the edge of the group with his hands at his sides and an expression on his face that people who didn't know him well might have mistaken for stoic. The people who knew him well would have recognized it as something else entirely. He had been wrong about a great many things in his life. He had been wrong about silence being the same as dignity, wrong about distance being the same as strength, wrong about a man being able to live properly alone on the assumption that the family he had driven away might eventually come around on their own. As if grief were a piece of weather and time were a remedy for all the things he hadn't said. He had been wrong about all of it, and the cost of being wrong had been 11 years he couldn't get back. What he had not been wrong about was Monroe. He had known, even in the years of silence, even when the silence had been so complete and so long that it was hard to remember what Monroe's voice sounded like. He had known his son. I known him to be stubborn and capable and decent and honest in ways that had come from somewhere, from Clara partly, and from the land partly, and maybe in some measure that Harlan was not too proud to acknowledge, from him. And it turned out that the man Monroe had become was a man worth knowing. It turned out that the 8-year-old who had walked 3 days across open country to find Harlan Voss was a grandson worth every mile of a bad ride on a sore knee in the dark. Before he had left Monroe's ranch, Callum had pressed his handprint into a piece of soft clay and given it to him. Fletcher had insisted on adding his smaller one right beside it. It had dried by the fire, and Harlan had carried it home wrapped in canvas and set it on the shelf beside the photograph, where it caught the morning light every day when he came in to start the coffee. A small and ordinary thing. The kind of thing that costs nothing and means everything. Some losses can't be undone. Some years can't be recovered. Some things said in anger remain said, and the people you failed remain failed in ways that don't fully heal and shouldn't be asked to. Harlan Voss knew all of that. He carried it honestly, the way you carry something real that has real weight without pretending it's lighter than it is. But he also knew this, that on a Thursday in late September, a boy with his father's jaw and his mother's steadiness had appeared at his gate and spoken a name that stopped the world for a moment, and that name had not undone the past, but it had opened something in the present. And the present, it turned out, was still large enough for what they needed to build in it. Next summer, Monroe and Ada and the boys rode south. They came down the North Trail on a clear morning in June, and Harlan heard the horses before he saw them, and he walked to the gate and opened it and stood there while they came through, all 4 of them, Callum riding his own horse now, a small brown mare that Monroe had given him in the spring, and Fletcher sitting in front of Ada with his hands on the saddle horn, and a serious expression that broke into a grin the moment he saw Harlan. They stayed for 3 weeks. They worked the summer cattle together. They ate at Harlan's table every evening, and the house that had been too quiet and too large for one man became, for those weeks, exactly the right size. When they left, Callum looked back once from the top of the North Ridge. He raised his hand. Harlan raised his. Then the ridge swallowed them, and the valley was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than it had been before. Not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of something that will come back. Of people who know the way and have left the gate easy to open. In the frontier, a man's life was written in the choices he made and the ones he didn't. Harlan Voss had made plenty of both. He had been the kind of man who could build a ranch out of nothing and run it well for 30 years and still manage somehow to run the people he loved right off the property with the same hands he used to build it. That was a particular kind of failure. He knew it. But he had also been the kind of man who, when an 8-year-old boy appeared at his gate covered in 3 days of dust and barely holding himself upright, opened the gate, listened, left before dawn, rode east on a bad knee without backup because his son was somewhere ahead of him in trouble, and that was simply the direction you went. Not every man gets a second chance at the things that matter most. Harlan Voss got one, delivered by an 8-year-old on foot, and he was wise enough and tired enough and finally humble enough to take it with both hands and hold on. Tell us in the comments, have you ever let too much time pass before reaching out to someone you should have reached out to long ago? What finally made you go? We'd love to hear from you. And if this story stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need to hear it today. There are more stories out here where this one came from. More lives lived at the edge of things, more choices made in hard country, more names that carry more weight than they let on. We'll be here when you're ready for the next one.